All right.
He's a liar.
Good morning.
Every time.
I think everyone's here. Am I correct? No one's We'll call attendance. We are here for the continuation of the final hearing in SB 2016-06. Before the parties introduce themselves for the record again, are there administrative matters?
Just one, I believe Mr. McElroy has a couple of comments that he'd like to make.
Thank you, Chairperson. If you recall from yesterday's hearings, there were a number of items that had been reserved for Dr. Kuhl in previous testimony. Counsel for the board was kind enough to go through the transcript from that and point out to me the references to those. I have confirmed that each of those items has been fully developed already in the transcript, and there's no need to recall Dr. Kuhl.
Thank you, Mr. McElroy. All right, as I understand it, the agreed upon schedule starting out today will be Dr. Roberts first, town witness Glenn Walker second, Dr. Bailey, and then Invenergy's witnesses Carter and Donta. All right. Ms. Romer? Oh, I'm sorry. Let's introduce ourselves for the record.
Good morning, Elizabeth Noonan on behalf of Invenergy, here with Michael Blazer, Nicole Verdi, Richard Beretta, and Alan Shore.
Good morning, Mike McElroy for the town of Oregon.
Jerry Elmer for Conservation Law Foundation, and with me at council table is Dr. Timmons Roberts.
Andrew Marcaccio for the Office of Energy Resources. Here with me is Deputy Commissioner Nicholas Ucci.
CLF calls Dr. Timmons Roberts.
Yeah, I know.
Good morning, Dr. Roberts.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
You have CLF's exhibit number 1, which is your pre-filed direct testimony, and you have CLF exhibit 5, which is your pre-filed rebuttal testimony. Is that correct?
I do.
Do you have any corrections that you want to make on exhibit 1, the direct testimony?
Yes, I have two.
Could you please tell us what those are?
Yes, the first one is on page 16, line 5. We want to strike the word "in," which comes before.
Dr. Bianco is going to give you the official EFSB copy and ask you to make the changes and then initial them.
So, page 16. Line 5 should read reductions that Rhode Island has made.
So you strike that and put your initials next to it.
And I initial at the on the margin on the right, or right there. And there'll be another in that exhibit. So the other is moving back a page to page 15, where I have two corrections. On line 3,
where it originally said 900 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour, should read 799. And on the next line, and I could explain that that's a calculation using the one of the exhibits that was referred to yesterday, Invenergy's response to the town of Burville's request on how the numbers were calculated for CO2 emissions, where it says natural gas emissions when the plant is running on natural gas would be 781 pounds per megawatt hour. Multiplying that by 8,400 hours, which is about 95.9% of the year, which comes up with about 749 pounds per megawatt hour average for the time that it would be running natural gas, assuming that oil, and then oil, which was referred to as 1,227 pounds per megawatt hour. If it runs about 360 hours or 4.1% of the year, that would be about 50 extra pounds per megawatt hour for a total of 799 pounds per megawatt hour. So that's where that number comes from. On the next line, where it refers to the current average on the New England electricity grid, which says is about 730 pounds. That to be updated, I would correct that to 710 pounds. And the source of that is from the New England average in the ISO air emissions report, which was referred to several times yesterday. On page 20, table 5.1, which shows 710 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour, and then on page 22, also in table 5.2, where it says 710 pounds per megawatt hour. And just for some context, I would point out that if you do the math, multiplying by the number of hours per year, that totals 6,999,240,000 pounds of carbon dioxide per year that this plant may emit. So that is a 6.9 B with a billion with a B. And if it's 89 pounds more than the state average, the New England average on the ISO grid, that's an extra 799,640,000 pounds over 20 years. Or if the plant were to run about 20 years, that would be 15.5 billion pounds more carbon dioxide than the New England average.
With those corrections, Dr. Roberts, do you accept your pre-filed testimony here today under oath?
I do.
Dr. Roberts is available for cross-examination.
Thank you. Morning, Dr. Roberts.
Good morning.
My name is Mike McElroy. I represent the town of Florida in this matter. I'm going to direct your attention to just a handful of quotes from the Department of Health advisory opinion in this matter, issued on September 12, 2016, under the topic of climate change and health, and ask you if you agree with the quote, disagree with the quote, or have no opinion. Okay? Yep. The first is set forth on page 28 of the DOH advisory opinion. And it says, in the last sentence of the first paragraph, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full, I'm reading the wrong quote, I apologize. It's the second paragraph, and it's right in the middle. It says, the U.S. Global Change Research Program states that human-induced climate change caused by the burning of fossil fuels is a significant threat to the health of the American people, end quote. Do you agree, disagree, or have no opinion?
I agree.
Later on that same page 28, the very last sentence, it says, the Resilient Rhode Island Act, passed in 2014, seeks to protect the people of Rhode Island and make our state economy and society resilient in the face of nearly certain, but not precisely predictable, effects of climate change. Do you agree, disagree, or have no opinion?
I agree.
The next page, page 29, at the top paragraph, talks about the Resilient Rhode Island Act, and it says that the Resilient Rhode Island Act, quote, sets the state's carbon emission reduction goals as 1, 10% below 1990 levels by 2020, 2, 45% below 1990 levels by 2035, and 3, 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Do you agree?
I agree.
I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, what effect would this plan have on the Resilient Rhode Island statutory goals if the production method now, not the consumption method, is used to make the CO2 emissions calculations?
I think you could repeat the question.
Sure. In your opinion, what effect would this proposed plan have on the Resilient Rhode Island statutory goals if the production method is used to make the CO2 emissions calculations?
I believe that the construction of this plant would make it impossible for the state of Rhode Island to meet its goals and the intent set forth in the Resilient Rhode Island Act of 2014.
Why do you say that?
I say that because, for several reasons. One is that the goals set forth in the Resilient Rhode Island Act are important, and they're the only policy that the state has on climate change, essentially on reducing emissions from climate change. If the plant were built, as I said a few minutes ago, we would be releasing, and the plant is running up to 6.999 billion pounds of carbon dioxide per year. The scale, I have for years been trying to understand the scale of this plant, and the testimony on Tuesday confirmed to me it's massive. The numbers, if you compare them with the total emissions in the state around 1990, which are the base year for those Resilient Rhode Island Act reduction goals, it was around something 10.7 to 11.3 in different reports, million metric tons of carbon dioxide. This plant would emit, let me get my numbers here, the problem is that million metric tons is about 2,200 pounds, so you have to do a little math here. This plant would be emitting about 3.175 million metric tons. So if our total in the state is around 11, and I'm using rough figures here, around 11 million metric tons, and this plant is emitting about 3.1 million metric tons. 3.1 is close to 30% of our total state emissions. That's a huge step in the wrong direction. This, the Resilient Rhode Island Act is supposed to see our emissions drop by 10%, by 45%, and then by 80% in those 3 years, 2010, 2020, 2035, and 2050. This is a huge step in the wrong direction. If you do the math on those, we need to get down to about 9.6 million metric tons by 2020. That would make that target impossible. Of course, now we don't think the plant will be online, so that won't be the one really. Maybe we should be just talking about 2035, when we need to be down to 5.9, roughly around 6 million metric tons. This plant will be producing half of all emissions that we would need to be down to in the state of Rhode Island by 2035 if it's running. That's not very long from now. If this plant is built, that's just 15 years into its operational life. How can you meet a target like that when half of your emissions are taken by one facility? The other half has to take care of the rest of the entire economy. It has to heat our houses. It has to heat our businesses. It has to provide fuel for our transportation. It needs to also have other sources of carbon dioxide emissions. So I would say it's nearly impossible. If we look to 2050, it's almost absurd on its face to build this facility. If we're 80% emissions reductions from a baseline of about 11 million metric tons is about 2.2 million metric tons. So you do simple math of 20%, what's left after you start with about 11 is about 2 million metric tons. As I said a minute ago, this facility, if it was running, would be by itself emitting 3.1 million metric tons, or half again more than our goals under this piece of legislation, our only goals in our state for what we're going to do about climate change.
All right, I'd also like to read you another quote from that same DOH advisory opinion. It's at the top of page 30. It's the first paragraph. It says, when considering expansion of the fossil fuel-based energy system, RIDOH believes that alternative energy should be prioritized when at all possible. This will not only help to prevent negative health outcomes, but will also protect the environment and the natural systems on which we rely. Given the negative impacts of climate change on public health, RIDOH supports the Resilient Rhode Island Act's goals and encourages efforts aimed at maximizing carbon emission reductions and the development of alternative and renewable energy sources. Do you agree, disagree, or have no opinion?
I agree.
I'd like to direct your attention to your initial pre-filed testimony, CLF1, on page 15. And I'd like to direct your attention to page 15, line 7. And what you say here is natural gas has been, and you emphasize has been, an important bridge fuel in this regard. The reason I say natural gas has been emphasized, a bridge fuel, is that we have now crossed that bridge, parens, away from coal and oil-fired thermal electricity generation, parens. We are now building a second bridge emphasized, that includes renewable energy for an increasing proportion of our electricity on the New England grid. Thus, building a new, long-lived, fossil fuel-fired plant now would be going the wrong way back across that bridge, back toward higher emissions. Could you explain in a little bit more detail what you mean by that?
Yes. The New England electricity energy system included a lot of coal-fired and oil-fired power plants. It's now almost entirely, as was discussed in the Tuesday testimony, for its fossil fuel portion of generation, reliant on natural gas. That has, at least if you're calculating emissions only from the site of combustion, reduced our emissions very, markedly. The natural gas is indeed lower in carbon dioxide emitted per unit of electricity, more efficient. It's cleaner in that way than coal and heating oil, whether it's number 2 or number 6. However, it's still not where we need to go. It was presented as a bridge fuel. The time for bridging is over. We are now seeing the impacts of climate change, which I'm happy to talk more about. They're coming faster and more intensely than even the scientists predicted. They are going to be devastating for our state. Our state is an important part of our country and of the world system, our species, and how we're going to survive this crisis of climate change, how we're going to make this transition. If we continue to stay on the track of building natural gas-fired power plants, we are not making progress. In fact, the numbers that I cited earlier showed that we would be actually slipping backwards. I want to make the bigger point, though, that regardless of the numbers, the precise numbers, and the number of marginal plants that are taken offline, for example, all these numbers are greater than 0. And in my second testimony especially, I talk about the need for us to reach 0 emissions in a very short time. I would argue that we really need almost a wartime mobilization, as we saw during World War II, as the U.S. economy shifted very quickly from producing, for example, automobiles to producing tanks and airplanes. We did that in 2 or 3 years, and we were producing hundreds of thousands of units in a matter of 2 years. That we need to do the same with renewable energy and with conservation and with efficiency. That is, every effort must be made on the side of both elevating renewables, of advancing all our local and other sort of backup renewable energy supplies and energy storage. But we also need to be reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, and that we currently have a fleet of electricity generating plants that, with the decreasing demand in New England, and especially if there was a genuine effort made, or a very aggressive effort made, I want to give credit to the state agencies around New England, including in Rhode Island, that are some of the leaders in the country. We have seen efficiency improvements and a rise in renewable energy, but it's not at the scale of the problem. If I cite a report by PricewaterhouseCoopers that suggests that we need 6% emissions reductions year on year. Most years we see 1 to 2% emissions reductions, and that's for example in our renewable energy standard, that is a requirement of a certain proportion of our energy to be produced by renewable energy. I think it's between 1 and 2%. We are not at the scale of the problem, and building a huge natural gas-fired power plant would essentially take us back the wrong way and keep us dependent on natural gas for a long time to come.
Let me direct your attention to page 19 of your testimony, Exhibit 1. And you were here on Tuesday when Dr. Kuhl testified, correct?
I was.
And you were here on Tuesday when Mr. Hardy testified?
I was.
And on page 19, beginning on line 7, you state, there are different ways, that is, entirely different methodologies, that one can use for calculating carbon emissions. One way of measuring carbon emissions and emission reductions is on a state-by-state basis. That is what the Rhode Island General Assembly chose to do when it enacted the Resilient Rhode Island Act. The respective state legislatures of our neighboring states of Massachusetts and Connecticut made exactly the same choice, to measure statewide emissions when those legislatures enacted the Global Warming Solution Acts in those 2 states. A completely different way of measuring carbon emissions and carbon reductions is by taking a geographical area that is not just a single state. And jumping down to line 19, you will note that the Invenergy proposal consistently calculates the carbon emissions of its plant in the context of aggregating emissions from 7 states that Invenergy chose, the 6 New England states, and New York combined. Now, you sat here through the discussion, and I'd like you to comment on why you feel that the Resilient Rhode Island Act, the policy in Rhode Island, and the acts in Massachusetts and Connecticut clearly use the production method to make these calculations. Why do you feel that way, and why do you think that's the correct way?
I've been working in climate change policy for 25 years. Through that time, including attending the United Nations Climate Change negotiations since about 2003. I've served on working groups of the U.S. Global Change Research Project. I've been a contributing author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, including a report that's coming out next month on how we're going to stay below, or how we might stay below or near 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. In all that literature, in all the accounting that's done on carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases, it's done in terms of how much is produced in a territorial unit. In all those negotiations, it's by country. The United States, for example, under the Obama administration, made a pledge to reduce our emissions 26 to 28% by 2025. That was based on how much is actually produced, how much greenhouse gases are produced within the borders of the United States. The Resilient Rhode Island Act, of course, comes from that tradition. The origins of those targets, for example, of 80% by 2050, came out of 1999 science, and include a Northeast regional governors, along with some of the Eastern Canadian provinces, premiers, agreeing to that target of 80% emission reductions. That was always based on the production or the generation-based accounting of carbon dioxide emissions. I know what was in the intent of the Resilient Rhode Island Act because I was there. I have led groups of students from Brown University who are learning about public policy of our state by participating in it. I'm very proud of that work. In late 2013, we began a process of drafting some legislation that we came up with the name the Resilient Rhode Island Act. And we worked with the governor's office of the Lincoln Chafee, the previous administration. And we submitted some legislation to the, starting with the Senate Environment Committee, to the Senate Policy Office. That legislation got rewritten by that office, and then we added suggested revisions, many of which were adopted. There was always these targets. We always knew that they were inadequate. There were people who said that it should have been stronger than 80% emissions reductions, that it should have been, the science arguably says that we need to get to 100% reductions, maybe by as early as 2030. But at the time, 80% emissions reductions was seen as what was possible. So we supported that. It was always based on production-based or generation-based accounting, and I'll tell you why I know that. Because I stood in front of that committee and I said, you might want to consider which kind of accounting you're going to use. And that there is this other kind of accounting called consumption-based accounting, which considers how much we actually, the impact of what we actually each consume in the state. If done well, consumption-based accounting is very illuminating on our impact on the climate change as individuals and as a state. For example, the state of Oregon, I refer to this in one of my testimonies, the state of Oregon has done some investigation of this. They would like to see if they could switch to that accounting method. But they found that if you really include the full set of upstream and downstream impacts of our consumption, or their consumption as a state, that actually would double the emissions of the state of Oregon. Why is that? Because all the products that we consume have in them embedded carbon. This paper was produced by a production stream, a supply chain that involved consuming fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases. The same with our computers, our furniture, our all these things. In the case of natural gas, it's especially important. There are important upstream emissions that must be included in a legitimate consumption-based accounting. And those include the leakage of methane from the extraction of natural gas, whether it's done by fracking, that is hydraulic fracturing, or injecting chemicals underground at high pressures to release natural gas, or whether it's done by conventional means of drilling natural gas. That is not included in the approach that's been taken in this case when people are talking about consumption-based accounting. When I said this, and anyway, there's many other examples like this, and methane, of course, is highly potent in terms of its, in how much it warms the climate. There is a lot of dispute about what multipliers one should use. The science is shifting on this, but it looks like it depends on what time scale you're looking at, because it's very fast acting. So the numbers could be from 20 to 25 to up to 100 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of how much it warms our climate. And the short term is very important. And the reason I know that the Senate Environment Committee and the Senate in general intended production-based accounting was that I said to them, you might want to consider consumption-based accounting. And they said, that's too complicated. We're staying with the set of, the way that we've always calculated this.
What about, you expressed the opinion here that Massachusetts and Connecticut also use production-based accounting. Could you explain your reasoning behind that?
Yes. Again, it's always been the way that it's been counted. In the case of the Kane decision in Massachusetts, I've at least read some of the briefs where it showed that the state would have liked to switch to consumption-based accounting, and then it was refuted in the brief by the Conservation Law Foundation. The reasons being that the legislature of that state can only legislate for the state of Massachusetts. The same is, of course, the case in the state of Rhode Island. We can say in our legislation, and I think this is said, that we should consider regional initiatives like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, right, the RGGI, or other, Northeast governors' agreements with the Eastern Premiers in Canada, but we cannot legislate for those states to make sure that they're actually doing the right thing. All we can control is what happens in the state of Rhode Island, and it would be against the U.S. Constitution for us to claim that we could do more than that.
I'd like you to direct your attention to your second testimony. I believe it's CLF 6. Oh, I'm sorry, 5. Page 20 at the top. Lines 1 through 4, you stated the EFSB must consider whether the Invenergy plant would cause unacceptable harm to the environment. Climate change is fundamentally an environmental calamity, and permitting a new major source of greenhouse gas emissions, such as the Invenergy plant, against the backdrop I have just described, would cause unacceptable harm to the environment. Do you still feel the same way?
I do.
That's all I have for Dr. Roberts. Thank you.
Does OER have any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Blazer.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, Dr. Roberts.
Good morning.
I think it would be fair to state that as we've gotten to know each other a little bit over the last couple of days, there are actually surprisingly a lot of things that you and I agree about, particularly about climate change and renewables. What did you say?
I agree. Apparently.
Mr. Blazer, can you speak up a bit?
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. And unfortunately, as you might expect, what we're going to do now is talk about some of the things we don't agree. So I hope you'll bear with me. At the very beginning of your testimony this morning, Mr. Elmer asked you to determine whether or not that you had any changes to your pre-filed testimony. And it appeared from the changes that you made that you've conducted a really detailed and thorough review of both your direct and your rebuttal testimony, is that correct?
I have reviewed my testimony.
Right. And other than the ones that you identified this morning, you have no other changes that you wish to make to your testimony, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Let's start with one. Do you have your pre-filed testimonies there? All right. I'm looking at page 8. It actually starts at line 12.
This is the direct.
The direct, I'm sorry, yes. And the question is, what is the purpose of your testimony? Do you see that at line 12?
Line 12 of page, which page?
Page 8,
Page 8.
line 12.
Yes.
See there? What is the purpose of your testimony? And you identified two here. I actually want to just ask you a question about the second purpose, and I'll just read it. The second of the two contexts in which I consider the proposed Invenergy plant is the potentially devastating consequences that construction of this carbon-emitting plant could have on world climate and national and world action on climate change. Do you see that? So I want to be very clear here. Is it your view that this plant, if built, will by itself have a devastating impact on world climate and national and world action on climate change?
Yes.
You're familiar with the advisory opinions that Office of Energy Resources has submitted in this case, right?
Yes.
And just for the record, so we all know what we're talking about, this board directed OER, and you understand when I refer to OER, it's Office of Energy Resources?
Yes, and you're speaking about the testimony submitted by Ellen Kuhl, is that correct?
Well, the advisory opinions.
I have reviewed some, but not all of these.
All right, well,
I'm not sure.
You know, all the lawyers in this proceeding seem to have developed a habit of reading quotes from things and then asking witnesses if they agree or disagree. I'm not going to break the mold. We're going to be doing some of that this morning too. So I'll follow you through some, or I'll lead you through some of those. But what I just want to focus on right now is the charge that was given to the OER by this board. OER, in collaboration with the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, known as EC4, and with assistance from DEM, the Department of Environmental Management, to render an advisory opinion as to, 1, the impacts of the facility on anticipated greenhouse gas emissions that would result from the proposed facility and the cumulative impact over the life of the project, and 2, whether the facility will conform to the requirements and provisions of the Resilient Rhode Island Act. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
As far as the charge to OER?
Yes.
Okay. And I assume you're aware that the Office of Energy Resources is Rhode Island's lead state agency on energy policy and programs?
Yes.
And are you aware that the mission of OER is to lead Rhode Island to a secure, cost-effective, and sustainable energy future?
Yes.
All right, here's where I go along with Mr. Elmer and Mr. McElroy. I'm going to read you some of the things that OER has submitted in this docket and ask you some questions about them, okay?
Yes.
All right. First is from the original advisory opinion. This is September 12, 2016. Clear River's natural gas units have an estimated net plant heat rate of 6,254 BTU per kilowatt hour, which would make it one of the most efficient combined cycle plants in the region. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I am not an expert on plant engineering or on heat. I don't really know much about heat rates. I am a sociologist who studies the impacts of climate change and on environmental policy.
Okay.
So I can neither agree nor disagree with that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Next quote. Its low heat rate, combined with the competitive cost of natural gas over the forecast period, make it reasonable to expect that CREC will be dispatched early in merit order and therefore displace less efficient dispatchable generating resources with higher unit costs of production, primarily resources that burn coal or oil as a fuel source, as well as less efficient gas-fired resources, all of which have a higher CO2 emission rate on a pound per megawatt hour basis. Agree, disagree, or don't have the background?
I'm not an expert on dispatch orders under the ISO. I'm also, that's not what my testimony is about. I think you need to ask other witnesses about that.
Okay.
Mr. Blazer, just because I'm following along, could you see the page numbers?
I am so sorry. Yes, that was all on page 16 of the September 12, 2016 advisory opinion. All right, so you indicated that you're really not familiar with what heat rate is. So accept this, if you will. We've said this before, so trust me, says the lawyer. Heat rate is simply the inverse of efficiency. If you increase plant efficiency, which is good, then you would lower heat rate. What that means is that the lower the heat rate, the better the plant is running and the lower the emissions. Does that sound right to you? If you know. If you don't worry about it.
Objection. The witness has already said that he doesn't know about heat rates.
Well, I simply gave him a plain English description of heat rate so I can determine whether or not he has any familiarity with that description or not.
My objection stands.
You can answer that question, but let's try not to go too far into matters that the witness has already made clear he doesn't know.
Right. Understood.
I would say I don't understand, I don't know much about this. I have a vague idea. I would choose not to speculate. I would say that I have a very different perspective on how one achieves climate change safety for our country and our world.
Fair enough. You are aware that there are gas plants that are more and less efficient?
I am aware.
You are aware that there are gas plants that generate more or less CO2?
Yes.
Okay. Could we pull up that exhibit? We're going to pull up a new exhibit. We'll hand it out first, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about it.
This would be entire sheet. Exhibit 182 for ID.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll represent to you, Dr. Roberts, that this is a listing of combined cycle natural gas plants in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, currently existing and operating. And you'll note
from this exhibit. And the source is, it's called S&P Global Market Intelligence. Actually, the original source is the EIA. You know what the EIA is, right?
Yep.
Okay. What is the EIA?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the Energy Information Agency.
Right. It's a federal agency, correct?
Yes.
All right. So and again, I'm not going to go through this in detail. We've established you're not an expert on heat rates, but you'll notice the numbers for these facilities for both heat rate and CO2 emissions described in terms of tons per megawatt hour.
Objection. Dr. Roberts has already told us he's not an expert on heat rates. We have a document that Mr. Blazer is testifying about, but this witness, that's neither his area of expertise nor what he has submitted testimony on.
Well, I'm going to focus just on the CO2 emissions, and he has testified about that, and it was covered actually by Mr. McElroy.
That's okay.
Thank you. We'll stay away from heat rate for now. You do know that Clear River, if it begins operation, will produce, in terms of potential to emit, of approximately 760 pounds per megawatt, or 0.38 tons per megawatt hour of CO2, correct?
That's in the ballpark of what I've heard.
All right. So if we're just talking about CO2 and comparing tons to tons, at 0.38, it would be the lowest emitter of CO2 of any of the facilities on this exhibit, correct?
I don't dispute that.
Okay, thank you. In the context of all these other less efficient plants with higher heat rates and higher CO2 emissions, is it still your view that this plant, if built, will by itself have a devastating impact on world climate and national and world action on climate change?
Yes.
All right.
Would you like some more about that?
No, yes is fine. Now we're going to go back to those quotes from the OER advisory opinion from September, page 17.
Before we move on to the exhibit, could I ask a clarifying question? The note down at the bottom says heat rate and CO2 emissions for planned and CREC are estimated. I don't understand what that reference is or even what that is saying.
I'm sorry, that's, I hate to testify, but just to clarify it, because our emissions are based on planned and estimated, how the facility is planned and what those estimates are. And those figures are in an exhibit that's already in the record.
But those figures are not on, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
Those figures are not on Invenergy 182?
No, this is, 182 is just with respect to the other plants.
So the note doesn't relate to what's shown?
That second note does not relate to what's shown.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Is there a document that shows the planned facilities that you could also provide, so we know what that note is relevant to?
Yes, we can. We'll do that by the next hearing. Absolutely.
Didn't you say that that was information that's already in another document?
No, I was talking about Clear River's potential to emit. I believe what Director Coit asked for is plants that are currently, we talked about some of them on Tuesday.
Yes, I think she was just asking that you provide the information that would go along with that note.
Right, and we can do that. We can do that. We'll provide that by next Wednesday, I think we're back.
And the record will reflect that the carbon emission rate of Invenergy's proposed power plant embedded in Mr. Blazer's last question to Dr. Roberts, that Dr. Roberts answered, those figures do not jive or correspond to Invenergy's responses to Burrillville's 7th set of data requests, page 16, dated May 17, 2016.
I suppose we'll cover that at some point down the road. May I proceed, Chairperson? Thank you. So, OER, September 2016, page 17. Because energy from less efficient and higher emitting sources across the state and region are displaced, there is a net decrease in overall CO2 emissions. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
I understand roughly that this, I have not reviewed that, but understand that this is the way that OER makes these calculations. I do not believe that's the way the world works.
Okay. Page 19. Energy generated from CREC will displace generation from the higher emitting marginal unit each hour that CREC operates, thereby lowering the system average emission rate. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
No opinion.
Page 20. Over the long term, the region's generation fleet will evolve to reflect further retirements of aging fossil fuel plants, continued expansion of carbon-free resources such as wind, onshore and offshore, and solar generation, and state and federal policies that will increase the cost of emitting carbon. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
I think it's uncertain, so I have no opinion.
All of these likely, same page, all of these likely future events will contribute to the further decarbonization of the bulk power system. Continued operation of CREC will foster this objective, or at least not impede progress. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
No opinion.
Still on page 20. CREC and other more efficient gas-fired plants will continue to put downward pressure on energy prices, narrowing the gap between the price paid to a generator and the cost of the fuel and other variable costs to produce electricity. This gap is commonly known as the spark spread and is directly related to the profitability of a power plant. Narrowing the spark spread puts increased economic burden on the remaining oil and coal-fired plants in the region. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
No opinion.
Page 21. As renewable penetration increases over the long term to meet the region's aggressive RPS, RES, CES goals, we expect that generation from all gas-fired resources, including CREC, will diminish and emit less CO2. Importantly, economic risks due to diminished operation of CREC as it competes with renewable generation and more efficient, cleaner plants in the future are not borne by customers in Rhode Island, but solely by the project owner. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
That's complicated, so I have no opinion.
All right. Page 27. Since CREC reduces the overall regional consumption of all types of fossil fuels used for generation, it is reasonable to conclude that the project does not increase upstream methane emissions and may actually contribute to reducing upstream impacts. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
That's complicated, I have no opinion.
Page 30. This is with respect to the Resilient Rhode Island Act. The construction of CREC will not impact existing statutory mandates designed to diversify and decarbonize Rhode Island's electric supply portfolio. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
I believe that's a speculative statement, and I would disagree with how the actual political system works in our state and in our country.
Same page. Construction of CREC will not impede Rhode Island from tackling emissions reduction potential in other carbon-intense areas of the economy, paren, transportation, thermal, close paren. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
No opinion.
So you have no opinion about whether the operation of this facility will or will not have an impact on reduction of emissions from transportation?
Mr. Blazer, I have been in the legislature. I've been in state agencies. And I think, who is there attempting to influence the policies of our state is influenced by who is in the state generating electricity.
Would you agree with me, Dr. Roberts, that the transportation sector is in fact one of the largest, if not the single largest, emitter of CO2?
Absolutely. In the state of Rhode Island, it's now 40% of our emissions. It's more than the electricity sector.
And in fact, that's true, once we kill all the coal plants, it's true nationwide as well, isn't it?
Yes, but there is one lobbying organization, the American Petroleum Institute, that represents all of these sectors. And they are in the State House lobbying on every piece of legislation attempting to reduce our state's dependence on fossil fuels.
Okay. Back to the OER opinion, page 30 to 31. OER concludes that CREC, will not impede Rhode Island's ongoing commitment to clean energy investment through policies and programs that include, but are not limited to, least cost procurement, the Renewable Energy Standard, the Renewable Energy Growth Program, net metering, and participation in multi-state clean energy procurement initiatives as authorized by the Affordable Clean Energy Security Act, such as the multi-state clean energy RFP between Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
Based on my observations, again, in our state policy system, I disagree with that statement very strongly.
Same thing, I think this is on page 31 now. These policies will continue to help Rhode Island achieve its fuel diversity and GHG reduction targets by supporting the continued penetration of clean energy resources in the state's energy supply portfolio. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
If the policies are strong and take an approach that does not just advance renewables, but also addresses the profitability of burning fossil fuel in Rhode Island, then that statement might be true. But it's not clear, so I would have no opinion.
The construction of CREC does not alter or hinder in any way the statutory and policy provisions underlying these key initiatives. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
Again, in the narrow sense, maybe taken by the OER, this may be true. In my broader perspective of how our system actually works, I disagree.
Page 32. According to ISO New England, adding more wind and solar powered resources in New England will paradoxically increase the region's need for more fast response, flexible resources, which in many cases will be natural gas fired generators. Until grid-scale energy storage technologies become economic and widespread, the region will be calling on natural gas resources to counter fluctuations in output from renewables. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
Again, I am not expert really on these technologies. I have been following the issue for 25 years. It's my non-expert opinion on that we do not know, and maybe it's almost stating the obvious, we don't know what technologies will be available in 5 years. We could not have predicted, for example, the affordability of electric cars and their distribution and the price of solar and wind power. We don't know the price of batteries. We don't know what kind of grid storage technologies will be available in 5 years. 5 years. So do I agree? I have no opinion on that.
All right. Page 34 to 35. These are OER's findings in this advisory opinion. Here's the first one. The facility will contribute to reducing CO2 emissions associated with electricity used in Rhode Island, which is derived from generating resources across New England, as well as imports from neighboring regions. In the long term, over the life of the project, CREC will not cause CO2 emissions across the region to increase, although its contribution to reducing regional emissions is likely to diminish. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
This statement is based on a different set of assumptions. I think it's quite a short-term perspective. I think I would say I disagree for the reason that this is going to be putting a lot more capacity on the grid, and there's likelihood of greater consumption when the price is low. In other words, we have not even talked about the rebound effect of the Jevons paradox that people consume more when the price is low.
Okay. Next bullet. Development and operation of the project is consistent with state energy policies and will not hinder Rhode Island from meeting its GHG reduction targets under the Resilient Rhode Island Act. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
With due respect to my public officials and the OER staff, I strongly disagree with that statement.
And then finally, development and operation of the project will not be detrimental to implementing Rhode Island's policies and statutory initiatives to increase energy efficiency and the expansion of renewable sources of electricity. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
Again, with respect to the staff at OER, who I think are doing a good job, I strongly disagree with this, and I'd be happy to talk more about that.
Let's switch to the supplemental advisory opinion. It's February 26, 2018. Just a moment. While Ms. Verdi is checking one thing, I neglected to move as full our Exhibit 182, subject to supplying the information next week that Director Coit requested.
Objection. There's been no foundation for this. Dr. Roberts didn't testify about it. He's told us it's a subject he doesn't know anything about. If Invenergy wants to put a later witness on to establish some foundation for this and context, we can consider that at that time.
I agree, it has no foundation in the record yet.
We'll hold for now. Let's keep it as for ID for now, and we can provide a foundation for it with another witness. Thank you. All right, I'm sorry, Dr. Roberts, the February 26th OER opinion, page 11. As discussed in OER's September 2016 advisory opinion, CREC is anticipated to be one of the most efficient gas-fired resources in the region, and therefore generation from CREC will displace generation from less efficient and higher emitting fossil-fired resources. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
No opinion.
Page 14. CREC would be one of the most efficient generators in the region, displacing generation from higher emitting fossil fuel generators without hindering the expansion of clean energy resources. Agree, disagree, no opinion?
In a narrow sense, I have no opinion. In a broader sense, I disagree.
With the increase in renewable generation and decrease in coal and oil-fired generation, the carbon intensity of the region's electric generation fleet has decreased in the updated cases relative to the application. Therefore, in the updated cases, generation from CREC displaces relatively less coal and oil-fired generation, and instead displaces more inefficient gas-fired generation, which mutes the avoided emissions benefit of CREC. Increasing the penetration of renewable resources, I'll stop there, which mutes the avoided emissions benefit of CREC. Do you agree or disagree or have no opinion on that one?
I have no opinion.
Increasing the penetration of renewable resources and renewable energy generation in the model therefore diminishes but does not eliminate the claimed CO2 emissions benefit of the project. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
No opinion.
Page 18. OER concludes that operation of CREC will contribute to a reduction in the region's GHG emissions from the energy sector. Agree, disagree, no opinion?
No opinion.
Page 19. OER finds that despite a potential delay in commercial operation date, the facility will contribute to reducing CO2 emissions associated with electricity used in Rhode Island, which is derived from generating resources across New England, as well as imports from neighboring regions. However, CREC's contribution to reducing regional emissions is likely to diminish over time. Agree, disagree, no opinion.
Uncertain, no opinion.
Development and operation of the project will not hinder Rhode Island from meeting its GHG reduction targets under the Resilient Rhode Island Act. Agree, disagree, no opinion.
I've stated earlier that I disagree with this statement. This is very clearly depends on how one considers the Resilient Rhode Island Act, which I think has been misunderstood by the agency.
And that's in part the issue of consumption versus production-based accounting.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay, we'll get to that in a little bit. Development and operation of the project will not hinder the implementation of Rhode Island's clean energy policies, programs, and statutory initiatives. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
Again, I have no opinion, but in the broader sense of how policy is made and how the world works of businesses, incentives, and things do not go as the economists model. They are models, so I guess I would disagree with this in the broad sense.
I think we're close to done with OER, but I just want to segue to something else for a moment. I'm looking at your pre-filed rebuttal testimony, page 19. You know when you're there.
Okay.
At line 14, here's the question. In what way is this discussion relevant to the permitting issue that is now before the EFSB? Do you see that one?
Yep.
And then I just want to focus on the beginning of your answer. It's at line 15. This discussion of climate change and the need to rapidly decrease carbon emissions should be the central determining factor in the EFSB's decision. You see where I'm reading from?
Yes.
And you still agree with that statement I said?
Yes.
Okay. I should have asked you this in the beginning, and I apologize. Who at CLF actually retained you to testify in this proceeding?
I am a volunteer. I am not paid for any of this work.
Oh,
and it's turned out to be much more work than I expected.
I'm not suggesting that you're being paid. That wasn't my question.
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
The attorney with whom I have had contact is Mr. Elmer, Mr.
Okay.
Jerry Elmer.
All right. I assumed you weren't being paid for this. I'm very familiar with your reputation, so I apologize if I suggested otherwise. I just wanted to know how it was that you came to this, and my understanding is it's in essence via Mr. Elmer, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right, let's go back to quotes. We would much rather have a new modern combined cycle plant running rather than older, less efficient facilities. Agree, disagree, or no opinion?
Who's the quote from?
That quote is from Bradley Campbell, president of Conservation Law Foundation, when he recently spoke about the footprint combined cycle facility in Salem, Massachusetts.
No opinion.
So you don't know if you agree with Mr. Campbell's statement that CLF would much rather have a new modern combined cycle plant running rather than older, less efficient facilities.
Objection asked and answered.
Was it answered?
Yes.
Actually, I wasn't entirely sure. I'm sorry.
Could ask the stenographer to
Yeah, would you mind?
answer,
Please. And then what was my next question? I apologize.
You don't know if you agree with Mr. Campbell's statement that CLF would rather have a new modern combined cycle plant rather than older emissions.
Okay. I'll withdraw that question. Were you aware before I just read this to you that that was in fact the position of CLF?
I was not, and I would answer only the following, that I don't know the context of that quote, and it may involve existing facilities versus brand new 1 gigawatt massive fracked gas power plant.
Well, if I told you that it relates specifically to, I don't know what the name is now, the footprint facility that is, I believe, recently come online, or was about to come online in Salem, Massachusetts, within that context, what would your answer be?
Objection, we're not litigating the footprint power plant, although CLF did have years of litigation on that power plant, and I would be glad to get into all of the details and minutiae of footprint. That's not before this board.
I'll allow that question.
Thank you. Do you need the question right back?
I don't have a comment on that. No,
All right.
No.
Thank you.
Can I add one thing to this?
Of course.
I represent myself, I'm not representing, I mean, I don't know how this works legally, but I am not in any way requested to align with Conservation Law Foundation's position, past, present, or future.
Well, could we go to your initial pre-filed direct testimony, please? Page 8. Line 10. Let me know when you're there.
Yeah, I see that.
Question. On whose behalf are you testifying in this proceeding? Answer. I am testifying on behalf of the Conservation Law Foundation, CLF. Is that no longer true?
That is still true, yes.
Thank you. All right, I think we were at your pre-filed direct. Now I'm at page 11. It's actually page 11 and 12. I'm not going to read all of this, but you'll see, starting at line 16 on 11 and going all the way down to, looks like 17 or 18 on page 12, you're talking about NEG ECP, which is the New England Governors, East Canadian Premiers Conference. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And there's a plan that they issued in August of '01 that you've included as Appendix B to your pre-filed testimony. And the policy statements from the Conference of New England Governors are clearly important. Would you agree? That's why you put it in here?
Yes.
Now you mentioned in your pre-filed, this is on, looks like it's page 12, line 15, that the most recent policy statement from them appears to be August 31, 2015.
Yes, this was filed a couple of years ago, so there has been some meetings, and I don't know the outcomes of those.
All right. Well, let's see if we can find out. What we're going to put up here is August 13, 2018, New England Governor's Statement on Regional Energy Affordability.
Remarks for the energy center 183.
All right, let me know when you've had a chance to look at that, Dr. Roberts, and I'll ask you a couple of questions about it.
Chairperson, I would just ask that Dr. Roberts be given enough time to read the document as well as the council.
I believe I just said that.
Can I ask which part of this document you're likely to refer to?
I'd like you to read the whole thing and then ask you a question about it. I want to make sure you're familiar. You're at least marginally familiar with it.
Okay, and you'll have an opportunity to read that over the break that I'm about to call for 10 minutes. So.
Thank you.
And I don't get
Well,
You do if you read fast.
Chairperson, just if I could ask for the intrusion about the witness not discussing his testimony.
You're not allowed to discuss your testimony.